All right, thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about a project that I did with the League of Women Voters in Kent, creating a community. So they're the community. They're driving this creation of a park access map for our county. So I just 2 years, is it 2 years? 1.5 years ago, got moved from being non-tenure track to being tenure track and given a bunch of money, which is amazing, to create a community mapping lab for Kent State. And so that is in progress. The maps in the map swap are related to that. They are the ones that are coming out of the map library, and we're building this community mapping lab where all those old map cabinets used to be. But in the meantime, I'm just kind of sitting here waiting for people to come to me with map projects. So I was pretty excited when the League of Women Voters came and wanted me to work with them on a park access map for the county, basically to inform their position on parks and equity. So I got super excited. They're interested in having me use the Trust for Public Land has a mapping tool that will rate your park equity. But of course I was like, oh, but let me make the map, it'll be great. So just to give you a sense of what the Trust for Public Land says about park equity, they're interested in walking distance, and they want there to be a park within a 10-minute walk of everybody's home in America. They have a ParkScore registered trademark index that rates park systems based on things like equity and access and amenities. So they have a tool called ParkServe, and you can go in there. It looks very similar to a lot of the tools that you can get online now, which I really think are important and cool, that let you input your community, even if it's a small town like us, Kent, Ohio, and it will give you the localized information. And so the way that they do it is they're interested in where there's a high population density, a large percentage of people with low income, people of color, places where there might be health issues, places that have a urban heat island effect of like 1.5 degrees or something like that, and high rates of air pollution. So that's how they have this magic, for the magic formula happens, and magically they come up with these rankings. And so this is the map that's produced for Kent, Ohio. And so the purple areas are the, is it gonna show up? Yep. Purple areas here are considered to be the highest priority areas where you should, if you were to put in a new park, this is where your new park should be located, right? And then the green areas, sorry, it's not COVID, I tested. Okay, so the green areas are where the parks are. But of course, I, as the map critic, which I'm sure you guys can all appreciate, were like, but wait, this is why I can do a better job, because things like, why are they focusing in on the Kent campus? Why are they saying that they need parks when they have all of this beautiful green space that's, in our case, not all universities, but in our case, publicly accessible? And so, you know, they've got like the front campus, there's a sledding hill that everybody brings their kids to whenever there's snow, and there's all these other green areas and a pond. And so, you know, probably you're familiar with this. Anyone who's been on a college campus like this has the same setup. And so, you know, that was one of my criticisms. Another criticism I had was, well, they are doing better than I am because my GIS skills are somewhat limited, and I wasn't going to be able to mark kind of the access based on walking paths or park entrances, and so they did that, which is good. But then on the other hand, I was like, well, how about people like cut-throughs and pedestrians and bikes? They could go maybe cut through this area, even though the park entrance for cars is up here. So that's another criticism I had. I mean, this is a criticism broadly speaking. Like, I just was like, oh, maybe I could do that better. That's something that only a local might be able to know. So that's kind of what I was looking for. You know, also, so they relied on Esri's park space map, and this is Open Street View. Those parks layered on Open Street View, and you can see that they missed some pieces of park. So I was like, aha, they missed some of the parks. But So I didn't know before I started working on this about that there was a parks layer that I could download from Living Atlas. This source is great compared to my source, which was calling up or emailing all of the different parks agencies. And so they would send me emails like, I have drawings in AutoCAD and I could save them as PDFs if that's helpful, right? We've all been there, right? And then, this is the county. They had shapefiles, but they were all in pieces of based on when they acquired the land. And so this is the meme that I posted on Twitter about that. So that was a great experience. So they have much better data than I had. So once I got the Living Atlas data, I was like, okay, now I'm moving along. I'll combine that with my local knowledge. And it turns out there's 112 parks in this county that has 180,000 people, so not bad, but also very complex when you're talking about figuring out park equity and park access. So I put a half-mile buffer around the parks. And so this is a map of Portage County. Kent, the city, is here. There's another city called Ravenna here. And then there's this big empty land, which will be important later on in my presentation, that used to be an arsenal. So sometimes this shows up as a park. It is not a park. You do not want to play there. It's maybe there's some mustard gas hidden there. They're not sure. Yeah, not so great. And unexploded ordnance, also bad. The deer like it, but otherwise that's not a park. So the other question I had to work with, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about next is working with the community and taking their input. So one of the things was we talked about, well, what does it mean? What categories of people are we interested in making sure they have access? And so I talked to them about kind of what other studies have looked at. And we came up with looking at households with no vehicle, households that are below the poverty level, and individuals with a disability. And so we took those categories and I identified the census tracts that had, unfortunately I could only do census tract because of the vehicle access. But we took those and we put them into QGIS. This is all QGIS. Put that in there and came up with a classic choropleth map of these are the categories, so are they highest in 1, 2, or 3, or 0 categories? And so that, came up with this map, which looks somewhat similar to the Trust for Public Land map. But if you look down in some of the places that are identified here, people aren't living there, so especially the arsenal, right? But then also these areas here, when you look at where the people actually are, they're in these 2 cities, and then these 2, Streetsboro and Aurora, those are suburbs. The rest of the area is very low population density. So it also means that people, I don't want to say they don't need parks, but they have large lots, so maybe not quite as much need there. So an idea that I came up with along with the committee, and this is something I would not have come up with by myself, so credit to the committee for this, is this idea of creating a population density vulnerability map, so a dot map that includes vulnerability. And so you can see the purple areas, the gray dots are people that are not falling into any of those categories, and the brighter the purple area is, the more vulnerable that place is. A few other things that came up, I'll go through really quickly. Do trails count as parks? And so every time we did this, I don't know if anyone's ever worked with the League of Women Voters, they're all about consensus. So we all talked about it. And so we decided, yes, trails count as parks. There's pros and cons to that, but should bus access count as access? If people don't have cars, they could use the bus. However, if you've ever lived in a rural county like I do, not really. It doesn't work on weekends. This is my house to one of the biggest parks in the county. It's great, you can get down here, but then you have to walk this whole route here, which is not so good. Another question that came up was, should we include the type of park? And that was something they felt really strongly about because people use parks differently, that we should show. You can see how this is going to start to get to be a pretty messy map because there's a lot of things that people wanted on this map. And so this is the map that we came up with. I brought a copy with me so we don't have to deal with this size issue here, but basically this is what it looks like zoomed in. We've got the buffer and we've got the population dot map, and then we've got the type of park. And then I outlined with the dark black the areas that are high need and low access. So I wanted to highlight, spend the rest of my presentation talking about two really interesting cases. The first one is where I was wrong and Trust for Public Land was right. And then the second one is where both of us were wrong. And I just figured this out yesterday. So I edited my presentation a little bit. So the first example, so this is Ravenna, which is the second biggest city in Portage County. It's the county seat. It's far lower income than Kent is. Kent is like a classic college town. Ravenna is kind of a classic county seat, in that it has a lot of social services and therefore an increased level of poverty. However, what they do have is a pretty good distribution of parks, so like one in each of these quadrants. This park is relatively new, and you'll see if you compare the two maps that I was saying, they were saying no access, and I did not outline it in black, meaning that it does have access to a park. And so what I discovered, and I've been here, so I should know better, I've got pictures of my kid here and their friends, is that they've got a great playground, and there's a big neighborhood over here, but in between the neighborhood and the playground is a hazardous rail yard. The kids like it, though. They're like checking out the train. But one of the interesting things that I also just recently discovered when I was editing this presentation is I keep going down rabbit holes, and one of the rabbit holes was how many trains actually use this? Apparently 0. There's a website that tells you how many trains per day. So where I live in Kent, we get 45 trains per day coming through our rail lines. This rail line has 0, so theoretically there could be a crossing here, I guess, but right now it's kind of industrial junkyard. So I was wrong. There is not park access in this high-density neighborhood here. You have to go all the way around. The second example is really interesting. I really went down a rabbit hole on this one. So the first thing is the Trust for Public Land map does not include anything outside the city boundary. So see how you've got, this is a hospital, so they don't really need park access, but then next to the hospital there's nothing, and that's partly because there's no purple outside of the city boundary, so that's a problem. And in mine, I said they did need park access, that there was no park in this neighborhood. And so, two interesting things. The first thing is, what's going on with this neighborhood? It's a high-density area with high vulnerability, but it's pretty far outside of town. It also has incredibly small lots, which when you look at this map, this is a lot line, so these are like typical city houses. Those are pretty small, but these are tiny, tiny lots. Does anybody know what is going on here? It's like a trivia question. Close, yeah. This is housing that was sold to African Americans during the Great Migration, so early 40s, not early 40s, late 40s, called World War II era. Remember the arsenal? So there were jobs at the arsenal. Folks were coming up from the south, and they were sold these teeny tiny little lots and promised that there would be a house on there, and there was not when they arrived. So this is a neighborhood that has long been disadvantaged. The city of Ravenna refused to annex it. They didn't have, because of that, they didn't have city water, they didn't have city sewer, and that's all the way up through the 70s. It's actually like a classic environmental justice issue of the lack of water and sewer and the refusal to annex that neighborhood. And then I really went down a rabbit hole because I pulled up census records from 1950, and you can see that the folks that lived here were Arkansas and Virginia and Alabama and Tennessee, right, was where they were coming from. And they're working as janitors and maintenance people. This one is government ordnance, that's the arsenal. And railroad workers, too, were living there. And you can still see houses. It's very hard to see this, but can you see this? They're very tiny houses that fit on these very tiny lots. A lot of them have been demolished, but you can still kind of see it through the neighborhood. And there's still a solid 100 houses in this neighborhood, high density, that should have a park. And you know what I found when I was going down this rabbit hole and looking around on Street View? There is a park. So this is where we were wrong. Like, I was wrong, Trust for Public Land was wrong. This isn't on Google Maps, it isn't on any of the other mapping services, but there really is a park here. So to wrap up, turns out that these global mapping tools that I was hoping I would do better than are actually pretty good at local mapping, and they're definitely a great conversation starter for groups like the League of Women Voters. I love community knowledge, but we clearly had a gap in knowledge. Nobody in the group knew that there was a park there. Nobody was from that neighborhood that was in the group, so got to keep an eye on that. Lots of messiness when you have to include everything that people want, but that's okay. And finally, one of the other interesting things was the fact that that some of the things, like the idea is you identify places that need parks, and then when you have the ability to create a park, you create a park there. But how about dealing with infrastructure issues like bus access, or dealing with that railroad that's blocking it, that's not being used for anything? And so to me, it actually, when you start looking at these specific cases, you realize that it's more than just building a new park. So I thought that was interesting. So to end up, thank you to you guys, and then also to the committee that helped me with this.